now it's time to talk about everyone's favorite thing, camera gear. Now, just a few years ago, video cameras and still cameras were two completely separate things, but now everything's kind of been blurred together and almost all digital cameras are going to be able to shoot both stills and video, which is great for you because it means you do not have to buy any separate equipment to do video. Now, there are some really expensive still cameras like Hasselblad and Phase 1s that are incredible for really high-end photos, and then there's some really expensive video cameras like the Arri Alexa or the Red Epic that are specifically made only for video. But since most of you guys are probably coming from the still side of things into video, we're not going to really acknowledge those cameras. We're not going to get into the details of the highest end cameras, but instead we're going to focus primarily on DSLR cameras and mirrorless cameras because that's probably what you already own. For the first 7 years of filming video for f-stoppers, Lee and I actually filmed everything on the Nikon DSLR cameras that we already owned. Because we had all the lenses and the camera started shooting 720 and then 1080 and now 4K, we were able just to simply switch over to video mode, shoot video out of our still cameras, and we were able to create an entire website and channel based on the Nikon DSLR video. But recently, in the last year or so, we've actually switched over to the Panasonic GH5 because this camera was specifically designed for videographers. It still shoots stills. I don't know that they're quite as good as the D850 or some of the other DSLRs, but it has so many amazing features built into this camera that really make filming and making video productions that much easier. With the smaller lenses, the smaller body, the in-camera stabilization, this camera is great for running and gunning, and we've just found that the video quality looks so much better on the GH5 than any of the DSLRs that we've shot previously. So the big takeaway I want you to get from this section is that you can use the camera that you already own. You don't have to go out and buy some expensive video camera for video, and you don't have to have an expensive still camera just for stills. You can use a camera that does both and produce really good results in either field that you're working in. There's really two types of lenses that you're going to encounter. If you're a still photographer, you're definitely familiar with the photography lenses. These are all the lenses that fit on your DSLR and your mirrorless cameras, but there's also more specialized cine lenses which are used primarily for filmmaking. I'm going to go through and tell you kind of the differences between the two, but I'm also assuming a lot of you guys are already photographers and you're already familiar with still lenses. These are typically cheaper than cine lenses. They're going to be smaller, and you guys probably already own a bunch of them. This is actually what we use primarily to film our videos. But if you decide you really want to take your productions to the next level and maybe you want to try to attempt a feature film or some kind of artistic project, you may want a cine lens because it's going to give you much more flexibility. It's going to be more professional, but in many cases, especially the type of videos we produce, we actually don't rely on these at all. So the first thing I want to talk about is focus. Now, believe it or not, these expensive cine lenses typically do not have autofocus built into them. Almost all of these lenses are manual focus, and most videographers would hook up a remote follow focus system to this lens, and then they would have a separate person actually controlling the focus remotely. Now, what you need to be able to pull focus is you really need a lens that has a geared collar directly on the focus ring. And as you can see on this Rokinon 35mm lens, it has all these really sharp gears that you could actually connect a motor to, and it's going to allow the motor to pull a very smooth and precise focus so that you could go in and out of focus and get that really cinematic look. Now, the other thing you'll notice with cine lenses is the range between the minimum focusing distance and focusing at infinity is actually pretty long. I have to turn this lens quite a bit to get from one extreme to the other, which is really nice because if you're trying to do a very subtle, smooth focus, you're going to be able to achieve that with a lens like this. Another huge difference between a cine lens and, say, a photography lens is that these have hard stops. When I get all the way to 0.3 meters on this lens, it stops there. When I get all the way to infinity, it can't go past infinity. If you were to hook up a follow focus to, say, a photography lens, you're going to be constantly going past your focus points because these lenses continue to focus internally even though you're at the maximum focusing distance. Now, on a camera like the GH5, it actually uses a digital focusing system called focusing by wire, and essentially as you turn the focus ring, it is sending a signal digitally to the camera to tell it where it's in focus. This is incredibly unreliable, and when you turn the camera on and off, it actually will reset the focus. So if you're shooting on a camera like a GH5, you definitely want to be aware that just because the lens is in focus at this moment doesn't mean that it's actually in focus when you reset the camera. Overall, between these systems, the focusing is going to be incredibly reliable and smooth with the Cine lenses, and it's going to be relatively unreliable and very jittery with a traditional still camera lens. Now at this point you're probably asking yourself, well Patrick, at what point do I need a Cine lens over a still camera lens? Well, for us the advantages of having autofocus built into the lens and being able to confirm autofocus on the camera as we're recording is way more valuable to us. But if you wanted to create really cinematic shots where you're going in and out of focus, you really probably want to add a focus motor to your lens, and in order to do that you're going to want to buy a Cine lens. Now all of that being said, there are some really cool cameras coming out, especially by Sony and Canon, that they will actually do a focus effect in the camera itself. The autofocus is that good that you can kind of do your in and out points, and I think autofocus in a lens is much more valuable because of that. But as you can see in this clip here, this is a focus pull from the new Sony a7R III, and it's pretty impressive. So basically, I don't want you to think that you have to go out and buy a Cine lens to still get this effect, but traditionally, on a high-end production, they are going to have a focus puller pulling on a Cine lens versus having a camera like the Sony or Canons. Now let's talk about the iris or the aperture. Now most photography lenses actually don't even have an aperture ring at all. It's all controlled digitally, and the way you change it, if you're a photographer, you're very familiar with this, you just simply change the rotator knobs on the back, and digitally it sets the aperture for when you take a photo or video. With the Cine lenses, they always have an aperture. It's right here on the side, and almost all of these, they're not indented, meaning that you can do a very smooth transition between f/22 all the way on this lens to 1.5. There's no little clicks, it's not a third of a stop or a half of a stop, and this allows you to get incredibly smooth transitions to where if you wanted to change the iris on your lens while filming, you'd be able to do that and get really smooth footage. But on more traditional still lenses, as you change the aperture, you're going to see that change in exposure as you click third stops all the way around your aperture. As you'll notice on this Cine lens, the aperture ring also is geared, which means you could add a second motor to this, and that's going to allow you to control the aperture really smoothly. And if you had this mounted, say, on a jib, a crane, maybe a Steadicam, any place where you couldn't physically reach the aperture, you could still have complete control over your aperture by having a motor attached to this ring. Here at F-Stoppers, we rarely change our aperture while filming because we do get that change in exposure. So this feature on the Cine lenses is not really that valuable to us, but if it's something that you want to change while filming, it's going to be much smoother on the Cine lenses than it will be on the still photography lenses. So now let's talk a little bit about zooming and the differences between a Cine lens and a traditional DSLR still camera lens. Now, if you've used a still camera lens, you know that you can just simply turn the ring on the front and zoom from, say, 24 to 70. But when you feel this, even though it feels fairly smooth, it's not smooth enough to make nice transitions with video. You're going to get a very jittery effect. Now, with Cine lenses, we don't actually have a zoom Cine lens here, but they work much the same way that this Prime does, where the zoom range is going to be very, very smooth, and it's going to have a really long pull, which means that if you connect a motor to this, it's going to allow you to zoom in and out really smoothly and get those nice transitions. Another thing you'll find with more expensive Cine lenses compared to still camera lenses is that many of these are actually parafocal. And what parafocal lenses are is they're lenses that they lock in focus and obtain that focus throughout the entire zoom range. So if I was to zoom in, say at 100 millimeters and focus at 12 feet in front of me, I could then zoom back to, say, 24 millimeters, and my focus is still going to be exactly 12 feet in front of me. If you've ever tried to zoom in and out on a still camera, you'll notice that you might be at 24 millimeters and have a nice shot, but when you zoom into 100 millimeters, the focus is off by several feet. Now, having a parafocal lens and having all of these geared collars for focus and zooming might sound really, really important to you, but outside of shooting like live sports or maybe like reality television, it's really not used all of that much. In fact, many big-end video productions, they actually move the camera as opposed to zooming in and out with the lenses. One last thing I do want to show you with this lens is a lot of cameras do now have a digital zoom built into them. So while this lens actually doesn't zoom manually, it has a powered zoom that actually works really well. This looks more like a camcorder that you might have. So if zooming is really important to you, but you don't want to add the follow focus system to a cine lens, there are these hybrid lenses that have an electronic zoom feature that will allow you to zoom smoothly without having to have all that extra gear. Another difference that you'll notice with more expensive cine lenses versus still lenses is a phenomenon called lens breathing. Basically what lens breathing is it's a phenomenon that you'll see when you frame up a shot and then you change the focus. You actually see the focal length changing. It might be 1 millimeter, it might be as much as 5 millimeters. I'm going to put two examples on the screen here with a lens that does not have any focus breathing, and you can see as I focus in and out, the entire composition of the frame stays exactly the same. But in the second example, this lens actually shows lens breathing because as I focus in and out, you're actually seeing the lens zoom in and out just a bit. Now, we honestly do not pull focus all that much when we're filming, so this isn't really a big deal to us. But even if you had a lens that exhibited some of this focus breathing, I'm not entirely convinced that many people out there would even notice this except other filmmakers. So if this is really important to you, you definitely want to make sure that the lens that you buy has the smallest amount of lens breathing. But for us, it's really not an issue at all. Let's now talk about stabilized lenses. Now, stabilization is extremely useful, and if you have optical stabilization in your lens, it's going to be a big lifesaver. What is optical stabilization? Well, basically, a lot of these cameras have a gyroscope built in, and without getting too technical, it basically stabilizes any motion that you might put into the camera. So if you have really shaky footage, this is going to help stabilize it and make it much more pleasing to watch for your viewer. And if you're a run and gun shooter like we are, you may not have tripods and monopods to stabilize your camera. Having stabilization built directly into your lens is going to be really nice when you just want to handhold shots and still have that stable, smooth motion. Now with cine lenses, the manufacturers have designed this in a way that they assume you're going to be mounting this camera on some kind of stabilized rig to begin with. So there's very few cine lenses that have this stabilization built directly into the lens itself. Now having optical stabilization built directly into the lenses is so valuable to us that we actually think it's more of a benefit than having these more professional lenses. So almost all the lenses that you'll see on our GH5 cameras and even our Nikon cameras all have stabilization built directly into the lens. Next, we can't talk about lenses without talking about the specific lens mounts. Now, each manufacturer uses pretty much a proprietary lens mount so that you can't use each lens between different cameras easily. Canon has the EF and the EF-S mount, Nikon has the F mount, Sony has both an A mount for DSLRs and an E mount for their mirrorless system, and Panasonic and Olympus both use the same Micro Four Thirds mount for their mirrorless cameras. Some manufacturers like Sigma, Tamron, and Rokinon, they actually make their lenses with all different mounts so that you can buy the specific lens that you need for your own camera system. Now, many videographers, they actually like mixing and matching different lenses on their system, and you can use little adapters that will allow pretty much any lens to work on any camera, but you might lose some functionality like autofocus, you may lose optical stabilization, you might have a little bit of vignetting or might have to crop in your sensor to use a smaller lens. But if you already own a bunch of lenses that don't fit on your camera, you may want to look into getting a few different lens adapters so that you can use those lenses on the camera that you already own. So now let's talk about focal reducers or speed boosters. Now, a lot of videographers love the look that you get with a large sensor and a really fast aperture lens. But many cameras have much smaller sensors and they kind of lose that shallow depth of field look that so many of us love. To combat this, many videographers use full frame or APS-C size lenses with a speed booster so that they can get the most out of their lens when using a smaller sensored camera. Let me quickly explain how this works. If you have a full frame lens or say an APS-C lens, it's going to project an image that the sensor is going to sit entirely in the middle of that circle and use up the entire projected space. But imagine if you use this 35mm lens and you put it on a camera like the GH5, which actually uses a much smaller Micro Four Thirds sensor. That sensor is only going to be capturing a small portion of the image coming through that lens, and you're going to lose all of the wide-angle look that you had with the lens to begin with. But if we put a focal reducer between the lens and the camera, it will actually shrink that image so that more of the projected image will be used by the entire sensor. What this does is it gives you both the effect of a wider angle image, and because the image is condensed down to a smaller area, it's also going to be much brighter. Now, here's a real world example. We have a Tamron 35mm 1.8 lens. This was made for a 35mm lens. So it's going to give you that really shallow depth of field, and because it's a 1.8 lens, it's going to let a lot of light in. We can then mount a Metabone Speed Booster Ultra 1.7x to it. And if we mount this to the front of the GH5 camera, we're going to be able to get all the benefits of a super fast prime lens and get that really cinematic shallow depth of field look, even though we're using a camera that's got a really small sensor. Perhaps one of the most popular combinations a lot of filmmakers are using is they're taking this Metabones Ultra Speed Booster and they're combining it with the Sigma 18-35 1.8 zoom lens. This lens is kind of a one-of-a-kind lens. It's a really cool lens because it's super fast, but it's also a zoom. And when you mount that on a smaller sensored camera like the GH5, it not only allows you to get a variety of focal lengths, but it also lets you shoot in super low light, and you can get that really shallow depth of field that a lot of videographers love. One thing you do have to be aware of when adding a speed booster is it is going to change the field of view. When this combo is mounted to a micro four thirds camera, it actually becomes about a 27 to 52 millimeter lens, and the aperture now becomes an f1.2 lens, which is incredible for low light and that shallow depth of field look. Now keep in mind, just like we talked about with the adapters for different lenses, anytime that you use a focal reducer or a speed booster, you are going to lose some of the functionality of the lens. Now this particular one, I can control the aperture, even though the lens doesn't have an aperture ring built into it, but I'm going to lose all of the autofocus features, and I'm going to lose the optical stabilization, which is what makes this lens so unique to begin with. So I know we've talked about a lot of different lenses and a lot of different features in these cameras, but the truth of it all is the gear you already own is probably adequate to produce great looking videos. But I did want to show you some of the upgraded features and some of the more professional options just so that you are aware of them. So now that we've talked about the camera gear, in this next section, Lee's going to show you some of the accessories that we own that allow us to get camera movements that look really professional.